Final project, critical review of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. Course, Diversity Constructing Social Realities, done by Iman Dornaika, date Thursday, March 13, 2025. Introduction. First, I want to start by acknowledging and thanking the land on which I work and live, as well as the people who have cared for it. I live on the traditional land of Coquitlam. The calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission provide an essential framework for resolving systemic injustices and past injustices experienced by Indigenous people in Canada. These calls for action highlight the necessity of re-establishing justice, healthcare, and education policies to promote reconciliation. Through the prism of privilege and power, this presentation emphasizes on the calls to action's strength, limitations, and implications for educational leaders. Also, it examines these calls critically, assesses the effects of structural injustices on efforts at reconciliation, and offers recommendations for significant changes. Personal perspective. As a mother, educator, and immigrant, I understand the profound importance of the calls to action in addressing past injustices and fostering healing for Indigenous people. I see the value of protecting and respecting Indigenous history since I come from a place where identity, culture, and belonging are fundamental. Personal perspective. My experience as a teacher enables me to evaluate these calls to action critically, comprehending both their purpose and the challenges involved in putting them into practice in real-life settings. I have observed how possibilities for minorities can be restricted by structural barriers in education, and I am able to evaluate how these demands aim to address these inequalities. Personal perspective. As a mother, I believe it is our shared responsibility to raise children who are respectful and culturally aware. Empathy is increased and real reconciliation is promoted when the truth about Indigenous history, contributions, and challenges is taught. These demands are essential measures toward justice, reconciliation, and a more unified future. They are not only recommendations for policy. Summary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. To promote reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, the TRC calls to action, which were released in 2015, include 94 recommendations. Legacy, the first segment, 1 to 42, covers important topics like child welfare, education, language, health, and justice. Reconciliation, the second segment, from 43 to 94, places a strong emphasis on fostering respectful relationships and making sure Indigenous rights are respected. It involves putting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People into practice and promoting harmony in business, education, media, sports, and religious institutions. Every sector of society are urged by these recommendations to make significant progress in healing and strengthening the ties between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. Resonating with Calls to Action 13 and 63. Calls to Action 13 and 63 truly resonate to me. Language has a vital role in maintaining cultural and identity, as stated in Call to Action 13, which seeks to acknowledge and defend the rights of Aboriginal languages. This speaks to me because language is a fundamental tool for understanding and connection and is crucial to preserving Indigenous peoples' rich cultural legacy. Since it addresses the need for inclusive education that promotes empathy and respect, Call to Action 63, which calls for the creation of a curriculum that incorporates Indigenous histories, cultures, and the legacy of residential schools also resonates with me. Both acts demonstrate a dedication to fostering reconciliation and developing an educational system that values and respects Indigenous people. Power and privilege. Power and privilege are the benefits that dominant groups have, and they cause Indigenous knowledge and language to be excluded from Canadian schools. The elimination of Indigenous traditions due to systemic biases is exemplified by the residential school system. White privilege, as defined by Peggy McClintock, describes how institutional injustices favor dominant groups, limiting chances for marginalized communities. McClintock states, white privilege puts me at an advantage. The enduring effects of this inequality of power are highlighted also by Appiah, who observes that we live in societies that have not treated certain individuals with respect because they were. Both scholars' words align with the experiences of Indigenous people whose knowledge and language have been marginalized and excluded as a result of historical power imbalances. Strength and weakness. Call to Action 13. One main strength of Call to Action 13 is its focus on the recognition of Indigenous language rights, which is important because language is essential to the preservation and transmission of culture. However, the current situation of Indigenous language revitalization efforts is limited by a lack of funding, resources, and infrastructure, which makes it challenging for communities to completely recover their languages. Strength and weakness. Call to Action 63. One of Call to Action 63's strength is its emphasis on creating resources and curricula that introduces students to Indigenous viewpoints, such as the history of residential schools. According to Battiste, this strategy provides a whole solution that would improve empathy and cross cultural understanding. However, according to Loxley AL, its effectiveness is dependent upon appropriate implementation, teacher preparation, and resources, all of which vary from province to province. Current state and barriers. Indigenous people in Canada continue to face discrimination, inadequate funding, poor housing, and healthcare disparities, which make it harder to fulfill calls to Action 13 and 63. According to Alfred, these difficulties are shaped by the legacy of colonization, which makes it challenging for Indigenous communities to recover their languages and traditions. Increasing Indigenous representation and understanding in schools is an objective of Call to Action 63. However, educational institutions frequently lack culturally relevant instruction and Indigenous led resources. Educational implications. Educational leaders and practitioners play a key role in addressing calls to Action 63 and 13 by promoting inclusive education that values Indigenous perspectives and histories. This requires providing training, working with Indigenous communities, and fostering an inclusive learning environment. Stevens and Downs emphasize that increasing diversity in education can break down cultural barriers and reduce prejudice, supporting reconciliation and greater understanding among students. Insight and application. One important conclusion drawn from this presentation is the urgent need for more accountability in carrying out the calls to action, such as set specific deadlines, provide long term funding, and include Indigenous communities in decision making processes to guarantee significant development. Furthermore, schools should include Indigenous knowledge as a core part of their curriculum rather than only as supplemental information. Recommendations for educational leaders. Professional development days. To provide educators with the opportunity for greater comprehension and development in this area, schools should dedicate professional development days for Indigenous education, giving teachers ready lesson plans and resources. To make it simpler for educators to integrate Indigenous perspectives into their lessons, educational leaders should give teachers ready made lesson plans and resources on Indigenous subjects. Speaker engagement. Principals can work with the district to organize and host guest speakers for school wide activities to give the students and the staff a chance to hear Indigenous voices and experiences. Recommendations for educational leaders. Greater Indigenous representation. Schools ought to employ more Indigenous teachers and administrators to promote inclusiveness and representation and enhance the learning environment by bringing in a variety of perspectives. Curriculum reform. To ensure that Indigenous knowledge is integrated across disciplines, education ministries should require that Indigenous perspective be incorporated into all areas, not only history or social studies. Community partnership. Schools should work with Indigenous communities to ensure that curricula represent authentic Indigenous knowledge and lived experiences. This will deepen the bond between schools and Indigenous communities. Conclusion. In this presentation, I explored how the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action 13 and 63 emphasize the necessity of systemic change in Canadian education by acknowledging the rise of Indigenous languages and integrating Indigenous perspectives into curricula. To help achieve these objectives, I have suggested actions for educational leaders like required training, more Indigenous representation, and more robust accountability procedures. Personally, I'm dedicated to implementing these goals in my teaching and promoting the inclusion of Indigenous people. The next steps for my community in Canada will be supporting Indigenous projects, encouraging communication, and making sure reconciliation is a continuous, inclusive process that honors Indigenous traditions and history. And here are my references for this presentation. Thank you for listening.